Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maura Keefe. I'm one of the scholars in residence here. Welcome to Pillow Talks. This series of 45-minute talks happens in person here at Blake's Barn, Sunday afternoons at 3:30, and then all of the talks are available as part of the online Jacob's Pillow season as well. Today, I'm delighted to be here to talk with the founder and artistic director of Contratiempo Activist Dance Theater, Ana Maria Alvarez. A very brief introduction to Alvarez and the company, because she's going to tell us some stuff that you don't need me to tell you. Ana Maria Alvarez is an award-winning choreographer, dancer, teacher, and self-identified movement activist. She is the 2020 Doris Duke artist, or a 2020 Doris Duke artist, and an inaugural Dance USA Artist Fellow. The company has been supported by the prestigious New England Foundation of the Arts National Dance Project grants, and also served as cultural ambassadors in Central and South America for the U.S. State Department. Alvarez formed Contratiempo Activist Dance Theater in 2005 in Los Angeles, and from the very beginning, the company has been committed to bringing to life voices not traditionally heard and seen on the concert dance stage. They do that literally with their voices, which we're going to talk about, but also fundamentally in the dancing. The work is rooted in salsa and Afro-Cuban and forms and draws from hip-hop, urban, and contemporary dance theater. The company first appeared here in 2009, and you can see a performance of that work in the archives. It's playing right now in the reading room. Today, I'm going to ask about the past, present, and future of the dancers and the dancing, of the choreography, and of activism, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So thank you so much for returning to the Pillow with this week. It's been great to have you here.
So great to be here. Thank you.
I was just saying to Ana Maria, I was like, we're going to take it slow, and by this I mean, like, let's start with the name of the company.
Yes.
I mean, I was thinking about, choices you make when you have to sort of say, well, this is who I am, and you made that choice 16 years ago, and I think a really thoughtful choice. But Contratiempo has like multiple meanings embedded in it, and I was wondering if you could talk about what you were thinking in 2005 and how the name has maybe deepened and expanded over time.
Yeah, so Contratiempo as a title was actually the name of my thesis concert at UCLA. And it was a piece that was really taking on salsa as a form of resistance, the idea of resistance being a critical and fundamental part of being in a democratic society where people actually were in relationship and conversation about things. It was during the Bush era, and everybody who was not agreeing with his policy on immigration, which now seems so, not intense compared to the Trump years, but those conversations a lot of times were kind of we were seen as anti-American if you weren't in agreement with what his immigration policy was, and that seemed so counter to what it meant to be inside of a society where resistance and pushback actually was part of our history, but also a critical part of what's actually made us be able to make improvements in that pretty bloody, nasty history. So I started off with that piece, and then we wound up kind of touring that piece. It became a company very soon after, and then the name Contratiempo stuck. It means the offbeat. It means
great. This is the part I really want you to talk about also.
It means it's the beat in between the beats. So it's a musical term. Whenever you meet musicians and talk about the contratiempo, it's dancing on the two, it's dancing in between the beats, it's dancing in a way that's like that, the clave, the ga, 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 that you just heard us clapping. It's all of that like deliciousness that happens not right on the on beat. And so I loved the idea of it being also a reflection of dancing against the times, dancing against time, dancing also inside of spaces of in-between and not existing inside of those delineated boxes, but being inside of the middle places. Yeah.
So you had clearly thought about the meaning of it because you would investigate it in your thesis. So now when you think about it, are you just like, oh, I nailed it? So I'm so glad I came up with that. Or has it expanded for you?
I mean, I think that 16 years, or it was almost 17 years ago that I was first coming up with this idea of Contratiempo as a thesis project. It definitely I feel like I was in a place where I was much more about, resistance, thinking of resistance as like pushback and fight and engagement. And I think as I've evolved and grown a little older, I think I'm really clear the power of love and connection inside of that resistance. And that resistance is actually, there's a deep compassion and commitment required for real resistance. And so I think that the nuance of I think the Contratiempo started off for me a little bit harder and more intense, and this sense of Contratiempo now for me is about connection and is about listening and is about engagement from a place of love, I think. So that's shifted. It's one of those things that I don't think about the name. The name is just the name, and I don't often imagine that we exist beyond that name. That name feels like so us. So.
No, I was thinking about it, and as I was doing research and thinking about what I was going to write for the program essay, and reading from a musician's perspective on how they define the term, and what kind of musician is declaring the absolute, essential, critical definition versus how I think you understand its nuance. Yes. Yeah. But the thing that I also was thinking about is that from the beginning, even before Contratiempo, that your dancing history has always been tied up with your understanding of how dance and politics might be related. That was your major as an undergraduate. How did you know these things are paired?
Well, my father is sitting in the audience right now, who is I'm a red diaper baby. I grew up, with union organizing parents, and very much. My sibling and I laugh. We grew up underneath the union organizing tables while people were sitting around talking about revolution and how they're going to, change the world. And we were just hearing all of this and absorbing it as kids. And I think that there's a way in which I grew up in a family where it wasn't a choice. It wasn't necessarily a choice to be being in action about the future in your life. To choose a path that was going to make a more loving and just world was just an expectation, not necessarily something that was oh, you're going to get to do that or not, you get to do that. It's no, to be alive and to be a human means that we're going to leave the place that we are living here a better place for our, for our next generation. And so there was a sense of the politics of art making. I think I always understood and knew that politics and community organizing had to do with love and had to do with people and had to do with community and had to do with family. I think when I met the Urban Bushwomen and when I met Jawole, she was someone who I think really solidified that for me, that I felt oh, I actually can be an activist. I can be someone who really transforms the world, and I can also be a dancer and move. And because before then, I felt in my body that they were connected, but I hadn't seen an example of the ways in which that worked. And I also think that there are ways in which my parents' generation, they fought so hard and so intensely, and sometimes I think they forgot the joy part and the love connection, beauty part that is part of art making and part of being a cultural worker and part of being a narrator in terms of storytelling. I think that there's a way in which they're learning that from my sibling, also who wound up being a composer and an artist.
Good. I'm gonna ask you about your collaborators in a moment.
Yes.
But I was thinking about one of the things that you have talked about is back to your notion of resistance, and that it's fundamentally for you built into partnering, and specifically coming from social dance traditions. Could you tell us a little bit about that discovery? Because that feels like a kind of physical realization that then gets theorized in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I think dancing and salsa and all of that was a social dance form or a social practice before it was ever something I was understanding or picking apart or theorizing about. In graduate school is when I started to really pick apart and understand the power of both resilience building practices ancestrally, that there are these things that we do in our families or we do in social situations that we kind of take for granted, but that are actually lifelines, these things that remind us that remind us of our greatness, remind us that we're connected, remind us that we're something big, we are part of something bigger than ourselves. And for me, salsa was very much that. I definitely, I studied in Cuba for quite a bit, starting at the age of 18. I went back almost every year for about a decade. And being inside of this, like coming in with salsa experience and knowing the form, but also then like really understanding the way in which the history of son and the history of danzón and those lyrics that were about working class struggle and those lyrics that were about telling stories and passing down information generation after generation that were really about resistance that transformed the way that then I thought about salsa when I came back to the United States. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does, because I'm also thinking about, and I'm going to ask you about, your choices about music, but it does feel like there's something about the built into salsa and the relationship between the music, the singing, and the dancing that is so essential, which feels like it feeds into your work.
Letras, the lyrics are, yeah, they're revolutionary songs often that are getting embedded into stories of metaphor and hidden.
So you also, I think, you make a great distinction between that kind of dancing that is a community building that everybody just learns to do potentially in a certain community that you would be dancing and you would grow up doing it. Very different from the training you were doing, going to ballet classes. In 2005, when you were putting these forms together on stage and sort of navigating what's it like to have this body of codified, a classically trained body, and then a social dance life, in 2005, people were much less maybe comfortable with the hybridization of forms. And I was looking at the dancers this week and thinking, how has their movement history been opened by the work that you've been doing?
Well, I feel like it's important to state that the last ballet class I took was when I was 15 years old. So that I don't come from like the canon in that way. I studied ballet very intensely until I was 15, and then I was told by a professor that my butt was too big to be a real dancer. And I was like, thank you for sharing, and I am going to find some other kind of dance to do because so at that point I discovered, I went to A&T State University in North Carolina, and I started dancing with an incredible woman named Egwen, who had a company called the Egwen Dancers at A&T, and she exposed me to Dunham. She taught me, all about
Dunham technique from Catherine Dunham.
Yes, Dunham's legacy. I learned Afro-Haitian. I learned Ghanaian, West African. I was exposed for the first time to Afro-Cuban. I had salsa was definitely in family spaces, but rumba and all of these kinds of forms that were connected to me culturally, but I had never actually had access to them in the same way. My whole world just like exploded. And I feel like my then training of rigor and training in the dance studio became about these forms that crossed over the world of social dance practice inside of also, Dunham was the pioneer of that, of bringing these practices that were vernacular practices that happened inside of community, but then turning them into these incredibly staged, beautiful ballets, right, or beautiful shows. And so learning about her legacy, I think, definitely was the precursor to start making some of those connections for myself. Again, with the Urban Bush Women, Liz's work for sure was something I was looking at, the New Dance Group, also just multiple sort of legacies, and learning about that through the university, of understanding that there were people that were doing work where they were placing social dance practice inside of the concert stage, but I always still in the university they got separated out, and I think at going to UCLA and having to do my thesis, there was a way that I was still being asked to separate them, and that made me mad. And it made me mad because I was like, I'm finally at a place where I'm supposed to be able to design things in the way that feels right and real to me, and you're still telling me to stop using facial expressions when I'm making a piece of art. You're like, that's crazy. My face is a part of my expression. So I started purposely bringing more of my social dance practice on the concert stage and into the studio spaces at that moment. And that was in graduate school. This was the first time that I think I really felt emboldened to really do that. And to back up again, I know again, this is like...
Okay, we're not going straight through, we're good.
One thing that I also feel like was a huge influence of that was right out of college. I went to Oberlin. Right out of college, I went into job that was a social service a job, Lifelines Community Arts Project. So I was dancing professionally, but during the day I was teaching these incredible 7th and 8th graders at Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And I was they were asking me to create pieces for their dance companies and their after-school programs. And I was making these narrative pieces about the lives of these students and getting to know them and getting to know their families and hearing about their stories. And finding that they originally hired me because I had all these different practices that I had, in my tool belt. But the thing that they really wanted to do was hip hop and salsa. Like that's like what they really wanted to do. So I was like, okay.
The kids did.
The kids,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well that's what we're gonna do. So then how do we incorporate those forms that you already really want to do into this storytelling? So I think that was also the time I started learning how to like deconstruct the narratives inside of some of these social dance practices as not going and doing the salsa congress typical like that thing that people expect you to do with those dance forms on a stage, but how are those dance forms actually incredible storytelling practices? How can they,
I think that's a great thing to recognize that moment, because I think that sometimes we don't notice, like, oh, you were already doing your research, right? Like
Yes.
that sort of openness to like what you were seeing before you and hearing from the people you were working with, which has become now a through line for your work. So what about the dancers? We expect that of you now. We saw it a little bit here in 2009. You've had a really impressive career since then. I mean, so now a young dancer coming to the company knows that that the variety of forms are going to be welcome.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the growth of the company that dancers have been more insistent on that, or is it less radical and not less angry and more like, oh great, here's a home for me?
I think many people find Contratiempo, when they find Contratiempo, feel like there's a place that I can actually exist in my fullest self, and that is definitely an experience that I hear over and over through our artists that have come into the company, left the company, some of them come into the company and stayed, is that this community creates a space where whoever you are and whatever you bring is welcome, and there's space for it, and actually it's a huge asset the more that you can bring and the more honest you can be and the more fully expressed you can be in that. It's important to acknowledge that like the work that I make is I'm not interested in like teaching a bunch of people to move like me. I'm really interested in what happens when we all show up with our fullest selves, with all the things that, whether it's stepping that you do, or whether it's like breakdancing competitions that you've been a part of, or whether it's, you've been dancing folklorico your whole life, and then you started practicing, release technique, and then like, what are all of the things that people can kind of bring, and that it's not that you have to leave anything at the door, that you can actually bring it all in and be a part of this process where like your full humanity can stay intact. Because I think as a dancer, that's what I didn't find. I didn't find a place where I could be my fullest self. And so I'm really interested in creating work that does that. So you'll see, I feel like the dancers are really, sometimes need coaxing or permission to like, sometimes we'll hire someone and think that this is what they do, and then all of a sudden they'll turn around and start like beatboxing, and you're like, what? You beatbox? Like, what is happening? Are you serious? I never knew that.
Because maybe they've been told by their professors,
don't
like,
do that. Yeah, don't do that in this space.
Show your alignment and your sense of the music and whatever.
Or even just like, that this is more of an Afro-Latin company, or this is going to be that's something that doesn't have anything to do with that. And I found over and over in our creative process that so much of it's about excavating. It's about excavating, like, what are the things that we are showing up with? What are the things that we can really like to really train us to play and explore and just throw ideas out there that many of them won't land, and many of them will just be a moment and an exploration for that day, but many of them wind up completely transforming the direction we wound up going. So I think a lot of my work as a choreographer is also as a community organizer, and like pulling the incredible power out inside of the space when we're all there together and collectively together. Yeah.
So you write about the company. You say, we are taking salsa back to its roots as a mode of expression for the struggles of the working class, and therefore are committed to making our high-quality professional performance work accessible for all, regardless of race or class. So talk about why you want to affirm that so directly.
Yeah, well, I think, again, I mentioned in the beginning son, danzón, like a lot of these forms that were the root of, and also bomba, and it's not only Cubans, but Puerto Ricans, and jazz, black jazz musicians in New York, and like all the sort of like roots of what created salsa, it's not singular, right? It's not one thing. And so I think for me, like taking back to its roots means actually acknowledging the history and where things come from. It's an acknowledgement of the African diaspora inside of Latinidad, inside of, all of these forms are rooted back to the continent, and understanding that lineage and being really clear about that, intentional about that lineage, both in movement, but also an understanding of history. And so I think the ways in which, we're rooting back as these forms are not commercialized forms that are, the purpose is making money or selling records or making the music industry a lot of money or all of those kinds of things, which I think sometimes our art forms have moved in that direction, like to be more palpable for audience, like general audiences or all of those things. What are the ways in which these practices can go back to the space of what they were originally intended, which was to tell stories, to re-narrate our future, to give us hope and power inside of spaces that sometimes felt really disempowering and really helpless and hopeless, to connect us to one another when we felt really alone. Like all of the roots of where those forms started is what I'm really interested in, both choreographically, but also as an organization. Like how are we continuing to root back into where these practices began?
So I think it's a fascinating thing to imagine, being in the South, discovering something in North Carolina, Ohio, then to New York for a stint. But you've stayed in Los Angeles. You went there for graduate school and stayed there, which is a very different, Latinx culture is very different on the West Coast from the East Coast and from the South. And how has being in Los Angeles and the changing nature of Los Angeles and the diverse communities, how do you think that place has had an impact on your development as an artist?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in LA and in New York, if I speak Spanish, people immediately speak Spanish back to me or even assume that I speak Spanish. In LA, people are like, "Ah, tú hablas español." Like, what? You speak Spanish? What's that? You don't look like you speak Spanish, right? Because I don't look Mexican. I don't look Central American. There's a way in which my whiteness is seen way more than my Latinidad in LA, and that took an adjustment because I was like, what? What is happening? The way that I'm viewed inside of spaces in LA sometimes is very different. With that said, I think there's a way in which building the work in Los Angeles, there's border communities, there's the idea of the Chicano movement where the border crossed them, the border was not in the same place that it is right now, and so you have generations of people who have grown up with Latinidad inside of their culture, but also have been born and raised in America for many, for the United States for many, many generations. There's the whole, just the community in terms of South America, Central America, which again, all of that work and those stories and those narratives have influenced our work because that's many of the people who have come through the company have been with those narratives. So it's not just the Puerto Rican, Cuban kind of salsa world. It's very much has, I think, expanded my work to be Latinidad as a much more bold and encompassing sort of idea, for sure. I also think Los Angeles is like one of the birthplaces of Black Lives Matter. It's one of the places where there's incredible radical work happening around defunding police. There's like work happening around housing and union movements, and it's a city where there's a lot happening, where we're passing legislation that seems really like unimaginable to some of the other people in the around the country, but it feels like a very exciting, vibrant place right now, especially, and has been for the last few decades, where there's just real incredible change and organizing happening. And so I think that's also influenced and affected the work, to be in those environments, to be inside of spaces where there are just really powerful conversations about futuring that are happening.
So I'm going to ask you about Joyous Justice, which is the work the company performed here this week, a version created just for the Henry J. Lear stage. And if you did not see the full performance today, or you are just here for the Pillow Talk, it will be available online in the online Jacob's Pillow season. So
or if you only saw the text part today, like, please, we do dance, I promise.
I mean, and I want to talk about it because people have seen it and experienced it, and it's freshest in your mind also. But it's also, I think, a great example of the way that you build work. So maybe you could tell us about and it also, for me, connects to my question about Los Angeles, because you're very specific that you did a series of workshops in South LA.
Yeah.
So that even as your definition of what Latinx communities has expanded, you also are delving deep into specific communities.
Yeah.
So tell us about how you started to build the work.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to go back to the piece before Joyous Justice, which was Agua Furiosa. And that piece, there, multiple pieces that we had created as a company. There was always this sense of like the transformation that the artist would go through from making the piece. Like, we would start off in these conversations, and 2 years later when we had the work, it was like people were different people, right? Like, we had literally all, and myself included, like transformed in terms of the ways that we were thinking about the issues that the work was bringing out. And I was really interested about how can we expand that outside of the dancers in the company? How could like the larger community or the larger framework of audiences be a part of that? Like, how could people be transformed by our process of making art? And so
not just the 10 of you in the studio,
yes, 10
but
of us in the studio, or even just like seeing a show, and there's a level of impact that you get, but like, how can we actually have this creative process that we go through be something that can exponentially grow outside of us as artists in a studio? And so that was originally the sort of the semilla, the seed of the choreographic laboratory. And so we built all of Agua Furiosa with this idea, that's a little Pollyanna, the idea of like, Los Angeles is so spread out. There are all these neighborhoods where we are a part of many of these neighborhoods, but people in the neighborhoods don't leave their neighborhoods, and it's so siloed. And so we did 11 choreographic labs all over different neighborhoods and all over Los Angeles. And what those labs look like is we would perform a little bit of the pieces that's being developed, to get audience feedback, like real, raw, what do people think, what are they seeing, what are the questions that they have. We would sit in council with people and have them share their stories, and we would share our stories around the themes of the work, and then we would dance, and we'd move together, and we'd create together. And we did this in all of these different locations. And at the end, we did have a ton of people come and be a part of it. But there was still a way, and they stayed in their own silos. Like, there was still a way that people really did stay in their own neighborhoods and didn't venture very far out. But we had this huge amount of community that were invested in the work and saw themselves in the piece. And it was really successful in that way. We decided for the next piece, which is Joyous Justice, that we really needed to root down. We needed to like stay in one place and continue to be working in one community. And South LA was a really natural place. Many of us live close to there. It's also, you all probably know it as the LA riots. We call it the uprising. It happened, like the place that where Community Coalition, which is the organization we partner with, began is right in the heart of Black and Brown Los Angeles. It is the neighborhoods in which the so much of the resistance movements around that I'm talking about with Black Lives Matters, with the bus strikes, with the labor movement, all of that is happening in South LA in such a powerful way. And Community Coalition started by Karen Bass, an incredible community organization that really was dealing with all kinds of different issues, and they were so excited to partner with us. And we said, if we have you as a partner, then it'll give us the capacity to have a home in South LA where we can then run these choreographic labs out of the same space every week. And for 2 years, every single Friday, we showed up and did sabor sessions, which are these like community get down jam sessions. Even when we felt like we didn't want to be practicing joy, we would show up and we would dance and we would get together and we would, be together with community. And the practice of that for 2 years is what really was the heart of what you saw on stage, or what we have wound up creating. I shared it during our Q&A. We did the story circling practice, and every single time we told stories, people always talked about their family, and they always talked about their mothers and grandmothers and matriarchs of the family, and so that wound up then moving the direction of the work. It wasn't like we were, having people tell a story and they'd be like, oh, that story is going to be on stage at all. That's not what we're doing. What we were doing is creating space for people to share themselves and their truths, and then the relationships that we built then helped to direct the direction that we went with the work. And so, we have so many people who are in that community now who feel ownership over this work and feel like they were a part of, generating this work. And so, it's been, South LA is still, I just moved my whole family there, and so now we're living in that neighborhood, and I just feel like we're going to continue to have that be our home base and continue to build off of that work for future works.
So I love to talk about a name. Let's talk about Joyous Justice.
Yes.
How did you discover that?
I think I always name things in the shower. I feel like I'm always so I'm probably that's when that happened. But I think the us, the collective, the we, the nosotros, the muchos somos, it's a Neruda poem about that we are many. There's this sense of the we felt like a critical piece to talking about joy, and also just talking about, as we've been building work over the years, I feel like I've been getting closer and closer to this idea of the we, and understanding the we, and understanding what is really us, and especially inside of so much division. I mean, we made this piece in 2018. It was a world that felt like, a lot of division, and a lot of division specifically in even our city. And so what would it mean to conjure a piece that was really delving into and embodying and feeling the collective we and the us? And so joy, us, just us, but also I think us as in U.S., Estados Unidos, United States, felt also an important, this idea of talking about justice with the U.S., that we have such a history of injustice and genocide, honestly, that we are all holding up these ideas and principles, but we have never gone to the root of our system, and how many of us weren't even considered human when the system was designed. And so, I just think the us felt like it was screaming out to me.
But to remind us who us is. And
yes.
Yeah. I think my last question before I open it up for some of your comments and questions is to ask you about collaboration. Obviously an essential part of your practice, rooted in labor organizing and community activism, which is fantastic. I think when we think about choreographers and their collaborators, it might be the dancers, which yours certainly. It might be a musician. It may also be a lighting designer or scenic designer. But you also have some ones that feel different. So maybe you could say something about some of your kind of less common collaborators whom you name.
I could. Shamel Bell is one of my, we always laugh because we made up her title as our Radical Joy Advisor, because she really is somebody who, throughout the entire piece, really became someone who would visit us in rehearsals, who I would just have late night conversations with, who, she and I just became kind of our relationship developed around the making of Joyous Justice. And So for sure, like, I don't know how many other pieces have Radical Joy advisors, but we had a Radical Joy advisor for this piece. I also feel like, I mentioned Community Coalition, but Carlos de Leon was our community liaison with Community Coalition, showed up to every single Sabor session for 2 years, was just like our community heart, the person who both worked for Community Coalition, but grew up in that neighborhood and understood in his bones the power of dance and his own saving of his life through dance. And he was an organizer, but he's also a dancer. And so he really became a huge heart of the project as well. Jacqueline Barrios, who's a teacher at Fauché Learning Center, who has, brought her students to see Contratiempo's work in 2007 or 8. Like, she had been, a long time teacher in South LA and a public high school in South LA. And she brought her students as we kept making new work and would incorporate our work into her teaching in terms of, like, she would use our work as an example of and how to connect to literature that she was teaching. She's an English teacher, and how she was storytelling and narrative building and incredible ways. And she was somebody who brought her students to many, many choreographic labs in South LA. So like those collaborators feel like critical parts and hearts and veins of the work as well. But I do have to say too that our company members are such a critical part of what make the work. And they bring so much of their heart, so much of their ideas, so many of their truths to the space. And the cast changes and things, kind of get recreated. And the show never stays the same. It's not like somebody leaves and someone comes in and like just learns that part. It's not.
Yeah, we need to recast the short dancer to do that. Yeah.
Yes, it is that someone comes in and they are now a new narrative line or a new truth that needs to be told, and that every single person on that stage, their story is inside the piece. And even if they are maybe learning a piece of choreography that existed before them, there is a way that we won't ask them to do that if there's not some truth in there for them, and that it doesn't make sense for them in their own story. So that's just a critical part of the work. And I couldn't do it without our company.
Oh, right. I just wanted to make sure we had time for you to say Radical Joy, and that you have an advisor for that, because don't we all need that? Okay, a couple of questions or comments, and I'm going to repeat them for the camera. So first, it's a little moment of sadness that she didn't get to see the fully embodied dancing today, but you will watch it online, which will not be the same, but it is beautiful.
July.
And understanding this moment in time in particular, and that we've just been in a pandemic. And you talked a little bit yesterday about that you just got back into rehearsal together a month ago.
Yes.
And so if you could talk a little bit about what that has done for the company.
Well, I feel a huge exhale when you ask that question, because I could not have survived this pandemic without the group of people that you saw on stage today. Like, truly. Like, we were there for one another in ways that were so profound and so beyond what I can even express in words. At the beginning of the pandemic, within the first couple weeks, we lost like more than half of our work for the next year. Like, it was our entire budget and future felt like it poof, dissolved in front of our very eyes. And we weren't sure how we were gonna keep being able to survive as a company, but we made a commitment that we were going to keep paying people with the understanding and belief that even if all the money ran out, then that was how we were going to end. We were going to use all the money to go out with a bang and to go out fully in relationship with one another, but that also with the belief that if we keep generating community and connecting with one another, that things will, this faith that things will work out. And so that's what we decided to do, which was very different than I think a lot of companies weren't in a position to do that and had to let go of people and kind of start from scratch. But we maintained relationships. Everybody went back to their own homes. But every single week for the last year and a half, we have met every single Monday morning and had a clear, sometimes it was 3 or 4 hours, and sometimes it was an hour and a half. And but we always met together and we always checked in to see how people were doing, to share what was going on. We were laughing in the Q&A that everyone in that stage had a breakdown at some point in time, and that we were there for one another and supported one another through all of it, myself included. And there was just a way in which it felt like we rolled up our sleeves and actually put into action the things that we stand for and the things that we had been both fighting for, trying to articulate, trying to embody for years, that this was like the opportunity to actually then see it and put it in action. And so through that, we wound up doing some online performing and online classes, and then we did get a few more film commissions, and things started occurring and happening, and we started doing it remotely. I mean, we did a huge amount of work remotely, and it started. We got a PPE loan, which got forgiven, thank God, and hopefully we'll get another one. And that absolutely helped. But it's like all of it together. But I think again at the heart of it was the people, and the people being there for one another. And it wouldn't have been possible without us making that decision to stay and stick with it. And there was I should say there was a month where we were like, okay, we are actually going to run out of money. Do we want to keep meeting? And people said, yes, we want to keep meeting. And so we did for that month. And then the following month, we were like, okay, now we have more money that we got a PPE loan and we can now do this. And so again, it was just, I think that faith of like knowing that with our relationship with one another that we were going to be okay. And it's powerful. It's really powerful. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the adaptation that you performed today. And props to dancers everywhere for their improvisational skills,
yes,
and production staff as well.
Yes.
But what we didn't talk about yet, and thank you for asking this question, is about the process of developing the text. Mm-hmm. And I would like to piggyback onto that and the rehearsal process of that, because
yes,
talking and dancing at the same time is hard.
Yes, absolutely. So Samad Rahim Guerra, I have to say his name out loud. He was one of our company members for many, many years. He actually now is in the Bay Area. He moved back home and is running an arts program up there. He's doing amazing work and got married. Yay, Samad. But he is a poet as well as a dancer. He was the one that had the beatbox skills. He was in the company for 2 or 3 years, and I had no idea he knew how to beatbox. So you didn't get to see the play duet, but there's a play duet where the soundtrack is him beatboxing. But we worked more closely together on Joyous Justice, even beyond just him as a collaborator in the company. We wound up kind of hiring him as a poet and as a writer on the piece, as a collaborator beyond being a dancer in the company. And all of the text that you heard, other than the Thanksgiving address was really written collaboratively. Toledo, who used to be in the company also, and myself connected with that text, and then asked people to kind of like add their own parts to that text, and it keeps evolving and developing. But every single other part that you heard was rooted in Samad's brilliance, and so.
I heard the tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti in the same.
Yes. Yes, he is from Oakland, so you heard that. You heard that right. He is born and raised in Oakland, and Samad is just a tremendous artist, and also what we felt, we actually called him into the space when we were down, and we were saying, okay, we're going to do all of the text from the entire show. Samad is here with us. He had just actually sent me a text and said, "Love to you all. I heard you were getting rained out, but I hope things go okay." And so I said, he's here with us, and so we are going to channel him today. And so that's literally what we did, was like we had Samad with us there.
So can you talk a little bit about vocal coaching for the dancers?
Yes. So Jeanette Caldames is a great example of someone she's our rehearsal director in the blue dress, gorgeous dancer, human being. She started off 2 years ago. When any time she would speak English, you can barely hear her, and she would speak Spanish, and it would be like bold and loud and clear, and it was like there were 2 different people speaking. I was like, and Spanish was her first language, and I said, when you speak in Spanish, we can hear you so powerfully. When you speak in English, I barely can hear anything you're saying. She began doing work with Paying Threadgill, who is who is actually one of my connections to Urban Bush Women. Her mother was one of the original Urban Bush Women, but she's a very close friend of mine from Oberlin, and she does incredible vocal coaching and worked with Jeanette for the last year, and I can hear Jeanette in English now. Like, it's incredible. Like the boldness of her voice is now showing up in both languages. So, and then there are people like Ruby who are, she was working for the Democratic National Convention during COVID. That was her day job. And she was completely and totally, she's been a community organizer her whole life. And so for her to get up and speak on stage, there's just like this, it feels like something that's like a natural calling for her. So they're different people and who have different skill sets, but our work is about, again, even if this isn't the thing that you're gravitating towards, like how do we help develop everyone having a voice and making sure that everybody has a voice. And so, yeah, that's, and we have a dramaturg also, Daniel Pena works with us around kind of, again, not just the ways in which people are speaking, but are the ways in which like a certain word will sound and an inflection in a certain word will land differently for an audience, and all those kinds of like nuances are things that we work on. And we sing and do things together, to get this warmed up too.
We have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, so the first, oh my God, I want to see this performance, which again, you can see a version online. Two-part question. We didn't hear much of the sound score today. How are you working? What's coming first? How are you collaborating? Maybe you're going to say something about Isabella here, and then when are you coming back?
Yeah, so I love the question about music because music is a guiding, it's at the heart of when I dance and improvise, and when all of our dancers and company members dance and improvise, music is very much at the heart of all of these forms that we're talking about. With that said, I think there are different ways and different parts of the work that has happened. So with Las Cafeteras, which they created several of the songs that are in the piece, those songs were like already in existence and already intact, and I heard them and I was like, I need to make something to this music. That was the relationship there. Disabella Grimes is a sound archivist, composer, sound designer. He's also a choreographer and an artist, an incredible movement artist in his own right. But his work and our work together has always been about sitting down and having conversations about the content of the work, the meaning of the work, what are the feelings of the work, and then me giving really clear space, like sample this piece. I love the way that this beat feels, and like the way that this the fire and that I'm hearing right here. Like, can you create something like that? And he takes it as like, okay, this is like my inspiration, and then I'm going to create something in relationship to that. Or even sample a little part of it and tweak it a little bit so it sounds completely different, or add, Muji, or add Celia Cruz's voice, or add like these different, James Baldwin, or add these moments of like people coming in and sliding in truth and power and charge and ashe inside of the music, and then giving me a version, we work with it with the dancers, and then come back and say, okay, I need it to like really hit at this moment right here. I need a drop out right here. I need like 3 clicks right here. Like giving very specific things that I'm like, I want to have happen. And so we work back and forth. Sabela also is notorious for turning on a recorder during our rehearsals and recording people. And then there's like an amazing part in Bukum in the beginning where everybody turns out, spins, and goes, ka, 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 ka. Don't use my voice. Ow! There's like, don't use my voice is Jeanette saying, don't use my voice. And like he literally took that in a rehearsal, put it in the thing, and then turns it into like part of the, it's like, or there's parts where Luca, my son, is like laughing or like trips and falls, and I said, oh, are you okay? Are you okay? And that's in the piece. There's like things that he's constantly recording, so you have to be careful about what you say because it'll line up in the work. So Sabela and I have a relationship like that is really, I love, and I feel like it's an incredible partnership to be able to work with someone in that way. And my sibling, Cesar Alvarez, who I created the first 2 or 3 works of Contratiempo with, we work like that together as well. It's like that, just back and forth in a conversation is the music and the dance. So, yeah.
I'm going to say confidently they'll be back. How about
Yeah.
that?
The question about, ask Pam. I would love to be back, and we were actually just thinking about, we're developing new work, and it feels like a little bit of a hole in my heart that we didn't get to work with like the Pittsfield community. I know that we had all these kind of ideas about
Right, because
engagement.
you were supposed to be here in the 2020 season that was
Yes.
canceled, which would
Yes.
have been a different version of
Totally
yep.
different version. And we have a lot of parts of Joyous Justice that are about working with community so that community actually winds up on stage with us. And, obviously that's not possible in COVID world right now, but I'm excited about the opportunities of being able to work with this community. We had almost 60 people show up to our Dancing Familias today. It gave me so much life. And I was like, yes, this is what we need to be doing. So, yeah, hopefully.
So, it's so great to get to talk with you, so great to see the very different versions of this dance that we've seen this week. We can blame the powerful dancing because they summon the gods of water, so they are fully responsible for your limited experience with it today. And I keep mentioning the online season because I'm so excited about it and how many more people will get access than who are able to see it this week, and I think it's a great innovation on the part of the Pillow. And keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much.
So much.